Well, hello again, everybody. For today's IHR History of Education session, delighted to see so many friends and colleagues here from around the world, and looking forward to an excellent session. Today, really delighted to be able to introduce Sam Baxland from Swansea, who's going to talk with us about his research on the history of Swansea University, particularly interesting case study in university history, which is really a burgeoning area of historical research, as we know. There'll be a short response by Professor Roy Lowe, who many of us know already is a leading historian, a participant observer, I think we could say, in Swansea, as well as a leading historian. And congratulations to Roy. Before I forget, on his new book, published this week, on schooling and social change since 1760. Congratulations to Roy. And without further ado, over to Sam.
Well, thank you very much, Gary, and thank you, Georgina, as well, for inviting me here today. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm only sorry in some ways we can't all be meeting in the person, but if we were in the person, I probably wouldn't have such a big audience. So there are real advantages to doing this on Zoom. I've also, for the first time, I was telling Gary and Georgina, first time in years, I've actually written my whole paper. So I'm going to read out a paper, which is maybe as a tribute to how seriously I'm taking all of this. I'm going to share my screen, which I hope everyone will be able to see. Please say if you can't. And I will. Ooh. There we go. I hope everyone can see that. So I will dive straight in. My subject today, as Gary said, is it's the development actually of the Singleton Park campus at Swansea University and the consequent impact this had on a sense of community there, and specifically the relationships that existed between staff and students. I should note, or I should reiterate some of what Gary said, because I think it's important, that I came to write about this topic as the result of a long postdoctoral fellowship at Swansea. The post was created for someone initially to collect a series of oral history testimonies of people who had worked and studied at the university. And 8 or so months later, it was extended so that I could write a full-length monograph to mark the centenary. The book was released in June, and then we celebrated our 100th birthday in July. From the reaction the book has received so far, I'm most pleased that my aim to not just write a dry institutional history seems to have paid off. I was given an extraordinarily free hand to write the kind of history book that I wanted to. And it's therefore, what I produced is a social history of post-war Britain using the development of the University College of Swansea to explore key themes. And a 3-year-long worry that I would satisfy neither people who were interested in Swansea or people who were interested in post-war history seems not to have come to fruition. So this talk today builds on parts or sections of my book, which is called Swansea University, Campus and Community in a Post-War World, 1945 to 2020. And I'm just getting the promotion in now by waving it at you. And if anybody wants to know why a centenary history only covers 75 years of institutional development, I can go into that maybe later, if people want to know. So I'd like to begin today in the immediate post-1945 years. Both Swansea and its university suffered badly from the Second World War. The college, as it was known then, didn't come under direct aerial bombardment as large swathes of the town, seen here, did, but activity there ground almost to a halt in many areas as a result of the conflict. Staff and students were drafted into war work of all sorts, and some were killed. The result was that the student population that had reached a peak of 800 in 1935 was now at a mere 342 in 1945. The college's site did not lend itself to an immediate or dynamic bounce back from the struggles of war. Swansea, which was the fourth and for some time final constituent part of the then University of Wales, had been established in 1920. And as we can see from this picture, which is taken in about 1945, it had grown through the grounds of Singleton Park, which is obviously this area of land. Long before the term campus had entered the lexicon of British higher education, the college was in a good place to expand on this site. instead of dotting its buildings through a city, as had been the practice of many of the late 19th century civic universities. At the nucleus of Swansea's college was this building you can just see here, which was known as Singleton Abbey. It had previously been the home of the wealthy industrialists, the Vivians, but it had degraded into dilapidation by the early 1920s. A series of drawing rooms, bedrooms, servants' quarters, orangery and stables, however, were transformed into, here's my favourite picture of Singleton Abbey, a much more modern picture, but I like this, this angle because it sort of shows the building with the parts of the town behind it. So yeah, sorry, these rooms, servants' quarters, orangery, etc., had, through the 1920s, were transformed into lecture theatres, offices, a refectory, labs, common rooms, and a library, much of which were still in place at the end of the Second World War. And the Abbey Building is still the main administrative and management centre of the university today. It's a brilliant building, but I never quite know how its sort of very eccentric design and winding staircases ever lent itself to, you know, hosting things like laboratories. It seems mad now to me, but it did for decades. In the grounds of Singleton Park, by this period, were placed a series of prefabricated buildings that housed the departments that had expanded to such a size that they could no longer fit in the Abbey. And what we see on this slide is the situation in the immediate post-war years. The college had acquired a new and impressive library, which is the building here, but it was also now a mixture of unsuitable neo-Gothic manor house on one hand and temporary demountable huts on the other. And these huts offered good facilities for the time, but they were not designed really to last. In the 1920s, they were sort of slated to have a 20-year lifespan, although of course in classic university fashion, they were still there being used 50 years later. Crucially, whilst there were small common rooms, a refectory and sports ground, as well as a dozen student societies in the years after the war, there was no dedicated social hub on campus. And almost everything took place, in the common parlance at the time, on a 9-to-5 basis, where the site shut up at the end of the day, much as a school would. The vast majority of students were local, that is, they commuted to Col, as they called it, most days from home. And that conditioned as well the 9-to-5 experience of the university too. Now, a key moment of change for Swansea's college, as for many other institutions across the country that relied on direction from the top, was the arrival of a new principal, John Fulton, or J.S. Fulton, in 1947. I could give a whole other talk about Fulton, his background, his career, his driving ideologies. For the purpose of this talk, it's probably important to say that he was closely associated with a generation of scholars and thinkers like A.D. Lindsay, his old tutor at Balliol, who believed fundamentally in reforming the way that people were educated at university. Fulton nearly took up the vice-chancellorship of Keele before coming to Swansea, which is significant for a number of things that I'm about to outline. Fulton fundamentally did two things at Swansea, both of which were in keeping with his ideological framework, and they also helped spur on a greater sense of community there. One was physical, and the other was intellectual. So to take the intellectual case first, Fulton believed in the importance of a liberal breadth, not specialisation approach that was becoming a greater feature of university education in the early and mid 20th centuries. This was given a further boost in the immediate post-war years by the memory of the war, with some linking the horrors of Nazi Germany to the narrowness of thinking and the specialisation that could result, or that it could result in. Universities were seen, therefore, as a central part in a different kind of conflict, one of winning the hearts and minds of their students and instilling values in them, which would simultaneously provide, quote, a new sense of value to the nation. In this period, and whilst at Swansea, Fulton regularly used phrases that kind of sort of accorded with this overarching philosophy. He talks of communities of learning and described his visions for what universities should become with talk of education for social responsibility and the value of diversity. And these all spelled out his liberal educational ideas. To put his ideas into practice, he initiated a few relatively novel schemes in the late 1940s, the most commonly cited of which, and this is commonly cited by all the people who I interviewed for the book, many of whom obviously from this period who are students are now well into their 80s, some even into their 90s. The most common scheme was known as the Freshers' Essay. And in the clip I'm about to play you now, which I hope works, the late Sir John Myrick Thomas, who was then the young son of a coal miner from the Gwendryth Valley, but would later rise to the top of the Royal Institution, he describes what this process of Freshers' Essays involved. And the he that he begins with in this clip is a reference to Fulton, who's on the screen.
He insisted that every first-year student should write at least 4 essays and read them to a member of staff in groups of 4, you see, you know. So I had to read a lecture, I had to read an essay to Rush Rees. Now, Rush Rees was Wittgenstein authority and a friend of Wittgenstein, right? I read another one to the professor of French. I read another one to the principal himself. And I read another one to Gareth Evans, who was an applied mathematician, a very interesting man.
Do you remember what the topics of these?
Yes, I do.
What did you read to Rush Rees in particular?
Well, the idea of leadership in a democracy.
Wow. That
was the title. But he didn't say a thing. He was pretty laconic.
Now, this exercise was a communal one, as Sir John Myrick Thomas said, usually conducted in groups of 4. And suddenly, there existed a scheme at the college that deliberately brought together groups of young people, often or almost always from different academic disciplines, deliberately, shoved them, somewhat awkwardly no doubt, into little studies where they would read their thoughts out to one another and to staff over tea. And this clearly forged a sense of community and togetherness. Such feelings could only have been strengthened by the fact that Fulton, using his connections from his time in the corridors of power during the war, brought various and relatively famous people to the college to speak to students as part of a freshers' lecture scheme as well. These included MPs, all of them, as far as I could tell, Labour, which would have fitted with Fulton's general philosophies, and not just because he was a friend of Harold Wilson, but also big names like Isaiah Berlin. People at the time, and in hindsight, reflected on how this sprinkle of academic stardust made them feel like there was something significant and important about being a Swansea student and being in Swansea. And this is part of a tapestry of ways in which Fulton tried to change the intellectual life of the college. The second way in which he had such a huge impact on the sense of community at the university was to quite forcibly push through the development and expansion of the site itself. Plans were begun on his arrival in the late 1940s, and by 1956, the beautiful Natural Sciences building was opened. This is my favourite building on campus, actually. It's still there. The picture on the left is the front, and then the picture on the right is the back. And obviously that picture shows lovely Swansea Bay, which I had to get into the photo as well. A few years after this, the shells of some of the most important buildings were visible on the campus, with one onlooker called buildings sprouting all over the college like the hills of a very determined mole. What was most significant about what was being built was that they would include a central meeting place, College House, and 2 large halls of residence blocks. And I'll come to the importance of these in a moment, but this picture is just a sense of the building work going on. This is the Natural Sciences building that I just showed. This is the skeleton of College House, which is about to come up. This is the chemistry building. The halls of residence are about to go here, and here are all those prefabricated huts that are still very much in use. Now, because of the time taken to build things, of course, a lot of this actually came to fruition after Fulton had left for Sussex University. When it comes to both the way the campus and the curriculum changed under Fulton, neither he nor Swansea are unique in what I've described, and nor were they even pioneers. But I think they're both important enough to warrant real attention by historians, not just because of the ideas about community that are my focus here today, but also for other very important themes. I mentioned Keele a moment ago, which, as I'm sure most people here today will know, was the real model for the British campus university and for the development of the holistic curriculum with its general first year that all students had to take. Keele's campus, based on the total residency principle, was and is on a much bigger and more impressive scale than Swansea's Singleton site ever has been or will. But by the luck of Swansea's college being located in a parkland, when it came to expand, it was able to do so with a bit of charm and foresight from Fulton, who persuaded the local council to hand over the extra land. Now, I won't go into the architectural developments of the campus in any detail, apart from to say that if you wander around the site even now, it's quite obvious that some of the buildings are distinctly late 50s as opposed to mid 60s, and there is a very big difference between the two. What I'm trying to say here is that Swansea was slightly ahead of the curve in developing a site like this. When you place it on a timeline of university development in this period, it's obviously behind Keele. But in terms of things like College House or the Chemistry Building, which is this one here, especially with its halls of residence, it's several years ahead of other universities because it had a sort of head start on its site development. And on the curriculum, Fulton was part of a wider set of people who were making the kind of reforms that he was interested in, or were big fans of them, like East Anglia's new VC Frank Thistlewaite, for example. But it's noteworthy that when Fulton left Swansea to become the first Vice-Chancellor of Sussex, he became suddenly much more widely known. But as one profile of him in the admittedly sympathetic New Statesman later said, he did most of his experimenting and therefore his important work at Swansea. So I think Swansea deserves a much greater place in the story of British higher educational development. And of course, the consequences of his ideas, of Fulton's ideas and his actions, were enormous. The beginnings of a much more solid university community were much more identifiable in this period, helped by schemes like the Freshers' Essay, but also by schemes such as, to take a famous example, short story competitions that Kingsley Amis would judge, sometimes after taking his own students to the pub, which is a true story. Sport was also a unifier, with busloads of Swansea students travelling across Wales to play teams from other colleges of the university, bonding in the process over Swansea's performance and the inevitable post-match drinks. But it was primarily the architectural changes on the site that resulted by the early 1960s in a major strengthening of this sense of community at the college. By the early 1960s, 25% of students at the college lived in the on-site halls of residence, and many others spent a lot of time in those halls with their friends. This 25% figure was obviously much lower than somewhere like Keele or the collegiate universities of Oxford, Cambridge and Durham, but much higher than at places like Manchester or the London colleges. And the 25% figure was also bolstered by those who lived in off-site halls of residence within a mile of the Singleton site. So much of the reaction from students in articles written about the college and about these halls of residence at the time talk of them being things like an antidote to restriction and loneliness, and also offering an unpretentious social life, or an entirely unforced sense of companionship. And this is a key phrase, I think, because it marks a break from the old 9-to-5 setup. They were talked about as a 24-hour experience. In fact, they were so homely that the evening cups of tea that students would previously have commuted home for were apparently sometimes brought to them in their rooms by the cleaning staff. And one person wrote, one person who was living in the new Lewis Jones Tower wrote, "No newcomer can ever feel the temporary loss of his mother and her apron strings in these pleasant and luxurious surroundings." Now, College House, this is in its fully built form here, not a shell anymore, was a major new central hub placed at the top of the driveway entrance to the college, and contained within it a library, study areas, bigger and much better senior and junior common rooms, as well as social spaces, a shop, a bookshop, and eventually a barber's. It was and remains an impressive building that acted as this new social hub for everybody on site. And incidentally, when Fulton died in 1986, it was renamed Fulton House, and it is so today. It remains so today. A key element to College House was that it contained large dining rooms as well. And these were complete with many of the features of an Oxbridge college, including long tables, a top table, graces in Latin, compulsory robe wearing, and all that kind of stuff. Students were expected to attend daily meals in the dining rooms. And again, not only did such an experience provide a sense of unity via sharing of a sort of semi-elite communal ritual, it also provided a space for the meeting of minds over formal but convivial meals. And I'm going to play a clip now from a guy called Peter Stead, who some people might know, who at the time was a young tutor in one of the halls of residence. And this is him describing the new setup in halls.
And I lived on the campus for 4 years as a tutor. And that was enormously successful. You were at the center of things. You met students from other departments, your colleagues from other departments. Dinners were still formal. We still wore our gowns going in for dinner. We had a high table with a fluctuating attendance at high table. I was actually in charge of arranging the seating at high table, which I took extremely seriously. Years later, I heard that there were people who had grievances against me because I always put them at the end of the table, or I didn't put them in the right place, and so on. But it meant that there was a social event every evening for an hour, and of course it would go on longer if it was a success. It was like an Oxford system. You knew every evening from 6:30 till 8 o'clock or longer if you wanted it. There was a discussion with colleagues from a number of departments, both students and staff.
Now, we have to be wary of nostalgia when it comes to moments like this. But it's also true that for some people, this deliberately designed sense of community had a huge impact on the way they experienced university. And it impacted their lives in the long term too. And this really was deliberately fostered by Fulton, as well as his successor as Principal J.H. Parry, and the architects in charge of designing the campus, a firm called Percy Thomas and Sons. They were very much in favour of designing pathways and walkways that actively funneled people into communal meeting spaces and things like that. Although the COVID risk managers at the present day Swansea are probably cursing Sir Percy and his associates now. Now, to demonstrate this whole thing about the community communal aspect from a student perspective, I'm going to play a very quick clip from someone who came to read English at the college from the mid-1960s. So here's his perspective on the dining culture associated with being in halls of residence.
It was on I went across to the hall dinner on the second day, and sat with some people that were nice enough, but I didn't think they were me. And then finally, one day, I think the third day I went across, and it was the table was full up. And I just turned round and there was a spare place, and I said, can I sit here? And that was it. The people on that table are still my friends today.
Fantastic.
So it was just like a kind of, I don't know, a light switching on or something like that. Immediately I felt comfortable in the university. I felt as soon as I had those friends that there was a genuine warmth.
These new developments meant that it was entirely possible to never leave the campus if students didn't want to, as they could eat, sleep, work, study and socialise all in the same place. One student from 1966 claims to have walked off the Singleton site, and it's not really a massive site, but claims to have walked off it twice in a whole year of studying there. Now, this has huge implications for town and gown relations, but that's a whole other theme that I do in the book, and I'm not going to touch here. But you can imagine what some of the implications were. Staff on the site who had a duty of care over students and were in loco parentis in an era where the age of majority was 21, also took a role in students' lives, leading them in things like hiking expeditions, which were very in vogue in the mid-1960s, or even simply taking care of them in various kinds of ways, including, according to one account, when a student sought their tutor out because he'd been stung by a bee. And unlike in digs, where local Swansea landladies usually and understandably operated a relatively strict regime and a limited visitors policy, study bedrooms were places to gather, drink coffee, chat the evenings away, play cards and have a smoke. And it was even the place for good-natured hijinks, which I know from my time in uni is probably one of the ways in which you bond and get a sense of being somewhere. So here in this clip that I'm going to play now is someone called Sal Lalani, originally from Nairobi, and here he is remembering one prank that he played on his housemate in the sort of mid-1960s, and he's describing a moment where his friend went downstairs to pick up a girl who was coming to visit him, and this is what he did.
When he went out downstairs to pick up Susan, we went in his room and took the bed and the desk out of his room and the chair so he could walk back Susan went into the room, there was no furniture then. We all disappeared. He had nowhere to sit. He was not a happy camper. Because, you know, in Sibley, he had a bed, he had one chair and a desk, and that was it.
And they'd all gone.
It was gone.
Now, again, with everything about rose-tinted spectacles taken into account here, I think the sheer delight in the voice of this particular interviewee captures how fondly he remembered that period and how it had stuck in his mind for over 50 years. However, this clip about a woman visitor raises an important point, and it's in this context and with this theme in mind that I'm going to make some of my final points, or comes to the final section of this paper, relating to the context of the fall as opposed to the rise of the university community. Just take a sip. There we go. So by the end of the 1960s, Swansea's college was experiencing a particularly lively version of the long 1968, with a series of protests, sit-ins, strikes, and a long dispute with staff members about the representation of the student voice on decision-making bodies at the university. And I detail all of this in my book and try to place all of these events into the wider story of student protests of the period. But for the purposes of this talk, it's worth saying that much of the sentiment driving the actions against authority in Swansea came from the kinds of rules and regulations evident in these halls of residence. Before the age of majority was lowered to 18 at the beginning of 1970, visits by Susan, for example, and other girls to halls of residence were closely monitored, with women initially allowed into the all-male halls of residence for 2 hours on a Saturday in the early 60s, extended to 2 hours a night by the end of the decade. And men, in return, weren't allowed into the women's halls at all. But women had to sign in and out. And there are some brilliant, albeit antediluvian stories from the period of, of hall wardens banging on the roofs of cars parked outside the halls, where a boy had gone with a girl to say goodbye, because it was after signing out time in the hall. Of course, not every member of staff took the view, as one did, that the two main halls of residence towers should be called Sodom and Gomorrah, which actually someone did say in a college council meeting. But there was growing evidence that a relatively old-fashioned staff body was coming into some form of conflict with a generation of students who were essentially post-war baby boomers, soaking up the spirit of that era, becoming increasingly informal, reveling in a sense of freedom and consuming many of the opportunities that the relatively peaceful and relatively affluent post-war decades offered them. Now, this drift of staff from students, or students from staff, was gradual, and as I'll argue shortly, uneven. But there are still totemic episodes which look to the historian like pivotal moments. In Swansea, one of these was the publication in 1967 by a small group of second-year friends of a tiny but mocking pamphlet called Shame, which, amongst other things, included sarcastic wordplay, and it also actively questioned the role of staff in the lives of students at the college. And, crucially, it sold like hotcakes. There is one copy of this that survives in the archives, and it literally is just a folded A4 sheet of paper. And it's quite tame, really, obviously, by contemporary standards. But it was clamped down upon hard by the college authorities, who threatened to expel those who had produced it. The deputy registrar, who dealt with the case, and incidentally who many, many years later ended up writing the previous history of the university before mine, a history that doesn't once mention student protest, incidentally. He had to deal with this case, and he condemned this pamphlet as, quote, blasphemous. When describing why they had produced it, one of the architects of Shame described it as a blend of just a bit of fun, meshed with a desire to question authority. In his words, this paternalism at the college was chafing. Of course, the reaction by the deputy registrar only confirmed to many students that the paternalistic instincts of the college authorities were indeed authoritarian, as they were claiming. This small episode proved that by the late 1960s that there were particular dynamics at the college. On one hand, there was sort of tightness and togetherness, but also there was resistance to aspects of how it was run. And the shame affair was cited for years later as a reason why things needed to change. From the 1967-68 academic year in particular, it's possible to note a real shift in rhetoric and action from some in the student body at Swansea, influenced, of course, by the climate of the time, and many of the events and movements that were happening across the country and around the world. This was led partly from the top, and a significant moment again was the election in 1967 of the first radical student union president, called Les Brooke, and he had been head of the Socialist Society, or SOC as it was always known. And in that election, he beat the president of the Christian Union Society into second place. And if that is symbolism for you. Now, when Brooke was elected as union president, he wrote an open letter to fellow students in the student newspaper, part of which read, "Now is your chance to shout your mouth off, complain constructively or destructively." Brooke's successor, Roger Trask, was in place during that series of protests and strikes that I mentioned a minute ago, one of which involved blocking the road running in front of the college in a protest at its unsafe nature and a lack of a pedestrian crossing. A student had been killed, had been knocked down recently, so that was one of the motives for that particular protest. Here's some of the evidence of it. I see this event as such an important moment because it lit the touch paper for a series of further protests. And that's why I actually put the protest on the front cover of my book as well, because I thought it matters. In a protest a couple of months later about wanting a greater say in college governance and an increase in their grants, students began a major occupation of the Abbey Building. This is picture footage, but there is remarkable film footage from the time as well that shows students barricaded in the old building, playing guitars and eating snacks off trestle tables. Although the students were actually being helped by a rebellious faction from within the academic staff of the college, what they were doing also had an impact on a different section of the university staff that we often don't focus on or don't really see in institutional histories. And by that, I mean the clerical and administrative assistants who had to work in the Abbey. And this clip I'm going to play now, which I think is my last one, is a woman who at the time was a junior personnel assistant. And she was working in the Abbey. And here she is describing the unintended consequences of the sit-in for members of staff like her.
The sit-ins were difficult. And I remember once having being reduced to tears by one academic because I just said, "I'm sorry, I can't do it. It's just not possible." And they wouldn't accept that.
Can't do what?
Well, he wanted me, there was some job he wanted me to do, which I didn't have the information, so I couldn't do it. And I just burst out crying because I must have been at the time, I must have been about, I don't know, early 30s. But, you know, it was that sort of stress is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Now, much of this was happening alongside the college launching, like many other universities across the country in this period, a consultation amongst its staff, asking for views on how much the student voice should be heard on the college's decision-making bodies and committees. The records of these discussions are very detailed, and they reveal a staff body, or at least those staff willing to write in, almost universally in favour of treating students on a more equal basis, many of them citing the collegiate atmosphere in halls of residence that would be strengthened if, quote, "the power of students to effectively influence decision-making at all levels of university life is made a reality," end quote. The reality was that the more the student voice was heard, the more they critiqued the system that had, amongst other things, helped foster the collegiality in the first place. Now, I'm not criticising them for doing so, but just sort of pointing out that there was unintended consequences of what they were saying, at least in the minds of these staff members who thought it could only be a good thing that the student voice was heard. In 1972, Richard Startup, who was a member of staff in the college's sociology and anthropology department, wrote an article in the Higher Education Review titled, "Is the University a Community?" Now, although the article didn't make this obvious, most of his research used data and information collected where he worked in Swansea. And he argued that after a period of student protest, tensions and conflicts are all too real. Not only can factions be observed, by which he means staff and students kind of blocks, can factions be observed which do not share common assumptions. At times it seems difficult for them even to communicate with one another. Within the space of 10 years or less, therefore, the culture and very character of the college and its staff student community had changed out of all recognition. And the period often denoted by the long 68 was undoubtedly a moment of liberation, of awakening, and of a kind of politicization that led to many positive things. But I think it's also worth stressing how a sense of unity and togetherness was never as evident again once this natural bond between staff and students, based on hierarchy and deference, was broken. It wasn't a rise in student numbers that broke these bonds, as is sometimes suggested. The surge in numbers that made it impossible for a university to feel like a small community happened much later than the early 1970s. But in trying to break out of the paternalistic shackles that in loco parentis had placed on them, students ensured that the atmosphere at the college was never quite as collegiate as it had once been. Resentments and tensions quickly became so much more obvious in the student newspapers, for example, which was clearly, in the sort of post-73 period in particular, was clearly entangled with the bumpy political and economic context of post-oil shock Britain. In fact, the pace of this change really is stark when a simple comparison exercise is conducted. For example, whereas the Shame pamphlet was criticised on the grounds of blasphemy in 1967, by 1973, the student newspaper at Swansea was not only printing material openly mocking of the college authorities, it was blatant in its portrayal of sex and drugs, essentially. Doodles of naked women and students dragging on spliffs were obviously still risque enough that they didn't feature everywhere and all the time, but they were there. And nobody within the university or the staff body tried to do anything about it or tried to control the content of the paper. And in turn, the paper was not deferential to them. Now, I think a lot of what I'm trying to sort of say here is quite interestingly illustrated in Linda Grant's novel, Upstairs at the Party, which to my shame, I didn't read in time to funnel into the book. But the changes in attitude and the behaviour of young people in this pivotal period in British history is darkly and sometimes amusingly documented by Grant, who wrote the book in part as a reflection of her own time at York in the very late 1960s and early 1970s. And one of the most striking parts of the novel is when the protagonists ring a lecturer to help them after one of the most disturbing, dramatic moments of the novel has happened. I'm trying not to give too much away in case people want to read it, but the reaction of the admittedly odd lecturer when they phone him up, even though it's obviously fictionalized, is drawn from something. And I think it's just worth relaying. So I'll just read this very quick passage from the novel. We had not been lied to by our founders when they said that the university would not act in loco parentis. And this is the student ringing the lecturer. We thought you could come round and help us. This is the lecturer. How very unfortunate. But now she's dead, she's not actually my supervisee anymore. I don't quite feel that I should take responsibility. It's not really a university matter. But we don't know what to do. Of course you do. You're grown-ups. You say you've already notified the police, and I will have someone inform her parents later today. I think that's it, really. You'll manage. You'll see. Now, obviously, this passage, like I say, is from a novel, and I don't believe even the most aloof lecturer at York would have reacted like that in these circumstances. But it's more about the climate that such a passage is a reflection of. And driving this break had been the open desire for students to be autonomous. However, I want to end by revising this image slightly. I think I've shown that, as I've said, a radical student body intent on using political means to shake off paternalistic shackles had consequences, intended or not, for the breakdown in the sense of community at the university. But I also believe that whilst this period was undoubtedly a formative one, and one of the crucial moments of change in 20th century Britain, I also think it was a very partial phenomenon, what we were seeing here. Because obscured by the coverage and pictures that striking students created, especially in the late 1960s, was a student body whose majority remained, in Swansea at least, firmly deferential, apathetic, and often small c conservative. Let me demonstrate this with some figures. The infamous sit-in at the Abbey was conducted, depending on which reports one listens to, by something between 500 and 200 students. Now, those numbers are big, but even if we take the 500, that only represents 15% of the college's student body at the time. During another protest, a petition of nearly 800 signatures was collected by students in a matter of hours, condemning what it called a vocal minority of left-wing students. Those organising the collection of signatures for that petition wrote to the local press to say that if they'd had time, many more people would have signed their list. When a petition went around in the late 1960s for students to express their disgust at the ongoing war in Vietnam, which is hardly a radical thing to do at the time, very common, it was signed by half the number of students who signed a separate petition calling for a greater range of beer to be served at the college bar. Now, my point here is not that I'm not trying to make a new argument, but I just want to add something to the point, which is that we often associate the long 68 with radical movements, but I don't think that mentality and those ideas were mainstream, even in a university college full of baby boomers, like Swansea was. But the impact of what some of these students termed, a minority of left-wingers was obviously huge, and in the long term, it had a real effect and affected change. So what I've tried to do in this paper is to avoid, first and foremost, a talk of portraying the late 1950s to mid-1960s as some sort of golden age for the college or for higher education as a sector as a whole. We all know and can think of many ways in which life at university would not have been pleasant for people in this period. And we can all identify ways in which the liberation of the 1960s led directly and indirectly to positive changes for students and others. But I do think when scrutinising this particular theme of staff-student relations and the sense of community at a college like Swansea, that a byproduct of the late 1960s liberal ideals was to push aside something that had previously mattered and which would never be as coherent again, namely that sense of togetherness and collegiality that I've mentioned. This was fostered and particularly centred on halls of residence, but also by academic schemes like the Freshers' Essay. A generation gap between pre-war era staff members and post-war era students obviously accentuated this drift, as did many other things. It's interesting to think, just as a final thought, now that staff and students in the contemporary world, in the here and now, are actually, or I find this at least, are actually more aligned than they have been for a long time. We're all relatively informal, most with liberal outlooks. And it's interesting to think whether an opportunity for a coming together of staff and students in an academic, intellectual and social sense again could, maybe even lead to another golden era of good relations. However, I suspect the sheer size of the sector and the multiple pressures put on teaching staff means that's very unlikely to happen. Thank you.
Splendid. Thank you so much, Sam. That was great. And what a wonderful presentation as well. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much, Sam. Roy, to respond, and then we'll be able to hear from our guests and audience. Roy Lowe.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the plug on the book at the start. Sam, I just want to be the first to say congratulations on a superb presentation, beautifully presented and very well illustrated. And it was enjoyable to listen to from start to finish. Now, Sam and I have been in touch, and he's given me the opportunity of a little prior notice of this. And the problem you've got with me is that I come at this from several angles. First of all, I was myself one of the so-called pioneer students at Keele. So everything he says about the sense of community, the small community at Swansea, is something that I lived through as a student. Secondly, my first piece of research, when I realized that I had to stay at university if I was going to stay in touch with my then girlfriend, whom I've now been married to for over 50 years, I had to do something to, so I did a thesis on the origins of Keele. And as Sam knows, one of the key players in that was indeed Fulton, J.S. Fulton. So I have a kind of background there, but then quite coincidentally, my final paid employment was at Swansea, where I became head of the education department in 1995. And I very quickly became aware of this tradition of the college and of many people who survived and stayed around and contributed to that. Now, I thought that there's a great risk, as I've said to Georgina and Gary, of me turning it into my own lecture at this point, and I won't do that. What I'm going to do is to abbreviate completely and just pose 4 questions for Sam to consider, or for anyone to chip in as they wish. The first, let's do it in chronological order. The first will relate to Fulton, but of a slightly strange way of getting there. The question, if I go to the point, is who was it that tapped Fulton on the shoulder to go to Swansea? It's a problem that puzzled me for many years, because Fulton was a very close acolyte of Sandy Lindsay, A.D. Lindsay, the Master of Balliol, and Fulton virtually wrote the curriculum of the University of, what became the University of Keele, during and immediately after the war. He was very close to people like Hector Hetherington and some of the other vice-chancellors who were into this movement. And everyone in town knew that Fulton was going to be the first vice-chancellor of Keele University. And suddenly he upped sticks and went to Swansea, to the horror of the people in Keele. They were stumped. And they turned to Lindsay, and Lindsay said he didn't want it because he'd just been diagnosed with cancer, and they persuaded Lindsay to do it. So Lindsay was no way the first choice, although he was the architect of what went on at Keele. And all posts at that time, at that level, were done through some kind of patronage. Certainly, it's a bit embarrassing to admit, but my first post at Birmingham was partly done on patronage. And the tap on the shoulder was something that was rife in university circles at that time. So was it Tawney, who was then on the UGC, who was party to it? Who was it? That's the first question. The second is about student mores. It was a fascinating period to live through as a school child and a student, because of so much that was going on in youth culture at this time. So I'll just reduce this to, it's a single question really, but I've jotted down how significant was the availability of the pill, the contraceptive pill, from 1963. I happen to know, somebody must have told me somewhere, that it became available to students in the autumn of 1963. How significant were the Beatles and the amazing change that took place in popular music? How significant was the ending of national service? There's a whole raft of changes, and the mood of young people was changing very quickly during the 50s and 60s and into the late 60s. And certainly I parted Keele in 1966, but my generation, who saw going to university as a massive privilege, were astounded at what went on in 1968. And it may seem a strange way to report it, but that was the case. Also, you must remember a key moment was the autumn of 1962, as I recall, when the Cuban Crisis was on.
Yeah.
When we really did think it was going to happen, some of us, or it might happen. And I remember we had to walk past the chapel on the way to breakfast every morning at Keele. And we had a kind of running joke, oh, look who's taken to go into chapel this morning. Never thought they'd go to chapel. Students were actually going into chapel to pray that there would not be a nuclear holocaust at that time. So there are all kinds of stuff going on. So I'd invite Sam to say a bit more about the background. Thirdly, and I won't dwell on this one, how significant, there are two terms that apply here. One is the tafia. How significant was the Mumbles tafia, which I won't dilate on, but we lived in Mumbles, and it was either Mumbles or Sketty. There were a number of very influential people, my contemporaries who were then profs at Swansea. Many of them had been students involved in the sit-in in the 60s, and they became a kind of pressure group and power group apart from the university. But also in South Wales, you've got what's known as the Cracac, which is the Cardiff establishment, and a number of business interests that were very significant in the University Council. So Sam might want just to comment on those. But a final question, very briefly, and then I will wrap up. I think I said I made a remark in the presidential address I gave in somewhere around 2000, whenever it was, to the History of Education Society. It was in a conference that I organized at Swansea. And one of the points I made there was that there was a growing fashion for sponsored or funded histories of institutions, particularly of universities. And I questioned whether you could have a truly authentic history of an institution if you were writing to a piper who was calling for a particular tune. And it's certainly the case that many of the or some of the histories that were written at that time, and I've got one or two of them up here on my shelves, were a bit laudatory about the institution and perhaps insufficiently critical of some aspects of what was going on. So the final question is, and it raises a much broader question for all of us as historians of education. What are the implications of funded research and the modes of funding of research at the present time? Okay, Sam, over to you. I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Thanks very much indeed, Ryan. Thank you.